And I'm humbled to talk to this group. I mean, and I'm pleased to talk to this group. I mean, you guys put in blood, sweat, and tears in making biodiesel a reality, and so I'm proud to say that I work for you. I get to serve as the Director of Sustainability for the National Biodiesel Board. The National Biodiesel Board is a nonprofit association. We're founded in 1992. The organization really grew out of university research. That was the first research in the U.S. that said, yeah, we can make our own fuel. We can make biodiesel out of, at that time it was soybean oil in 1992, and decided to establish a trade association to continue the research to make it happen for real, to make it commercial and get it up off the ground. And it took a while. We've been at it more than 20 years, and probably in the early 2000s we really saw biodiesel become a commercial reality. I joined the staff in 2007. I'd been an environmental regulator for about a dozen years, and I thought we were doing fantastic work with the state of Missouri where I worked to make the water and air cleaner, but we had real challenges with energy. And so the National Biodiesel Board was founded in my hometown, and I happened to know the CEO because his mom and my mom taught school together when we sort of grew up in the same community. And so I thought, I came to the Biodiesel Board because I thought there was promise there in renewable fuels. There was definitely a need, and I wanted to use all the skills I had learned in environmental regulations to make sure that we kept biodiesel on the straight and narrow and made sure that it fulfilled all the environmental promises. So, and I know many of you have heard me speak before, and many of you already know all the stuff I'm going to say. It may be some of the reasons why you've gotten into the business. There's lots of reasons to do biodiesel. And I'm going to talk just about a few of them that I think are important for the work I do, important for the policies that make biodiesel a reality. Again, I'm humbled to speak to you because I know that you guys produce biodiesel, use it, and love it, and you already know it's a good fuel. I hope maybe I could just sort of re-encourage you, or in case you had questions that popped up about the sustainability of biodiesel, about biodiesel's growth, or biodiesel's future, or the sustainability of feedstocks. I certainly want to welcome any of those questions. These slides I have up here are generally not important. What's important is how I can share information with you. And in my role as Director of Sustainability, we formed this role about a year after I'd come on staff with the National Biodiesel Board, because that's when biodiesel really started to become a commercial reality. That's really when the criticism started popping up, or the questions started popping up. So yeah, biodiesel is great. If you have a gallon of biodiesel that you make from a waste material or even a vegetable oil, that's fantastic. But how are you going to make hundreds of millions of gallons and still maintain that sustainability? And so our organization developed my position to really define what biodiesel is, how we can fulfill our environmental promises. If we weren't there defining our industry, somebody else would do it for us. It's our industry. We know it best. We have direct access to our producers and the farmers that produce feedstocks and so on. So we step forward to develop this position. And a lot of what I do is really follow the science that gets done at DOE laboratories like Argonne or Oak Ridge National Laboratory, or academic institutions where the real scientific research is done and the real papers are published there. And we just help coordinate all those experts so that they know who's doing what part of the research, and they can use the best available data and the best available methods to define biodiesel's impacts. And most of it's life cycle analysis. The majority of what I do is related to greenhouse gas analysis, partly because that's important for public policy. All the public policies that make biodiesel a commercial reality, either at the national level, being the federal renewable fuel standard, or state policies like the California low carbon fuel standard, all have greenhouse gas emissions as the core eligibility requirement for biodiesel and other renewable fuels. So, and this is a slide I use all the time just to remind people that liquid fuel is a necessity. We're starting to realize that fossil fuels that we rely on are not sustainable for several reasons. And maybe we can reduce the amount of energy we use, but there are a lot of things that we are dependent upon, that we have to have liquid forms of energy. And a lot of these things are not optional. Food production, all of our commerce, and public safety, national security all rely on liquid fuel, particularly diesel fuel. So liquid fuel is always going to be important to us. Even if we learn to conserve and reduce energy and use electricity in new ways and capture solar energy in new ways, we're always going to need liquid fuels. And particularly, if we want to be sustainable, if we want to make society sustainable, we have to make our sources of energy sustainable. That means we need liquid fuels that are renewable, that are energy efficient, that are environmentally friendly, and that recycle carbon. And there are lots of things that make biodiesel sustainable besides just greenhouse gases. And this is just bullet points that I, just brainstorming myself, thought like, these are what makes biodiesel really cool. We have real environmental benefits. We have real energy security benefits, displacing imported petroleum. We support real local and domestic jobs, and that has economic impact that ripples throughout the economy. And particularly the people in the industry and the leadership of the industry have demonstrated commitment to fuel quality, so that protects the reputation of the industry. The National Biodiesel Board has always had an emphasis on science and quantified analysis. We never ask anybody, whether regulators or consumers, we never ask anybody to trust us. We always go out and find somebody who knows what they're doing to quantify, whether we're talking about greenhouse gas analysis or energy balance, whatever it is, we always invest in the science to quantify what's really going on out there. Education and outreach is an important part of what my organization does. That's one thing I'm actually critical of. Probably one thing we need to do more of is the education and outreach. We're challenged because we are a small industry, because we are a small organization. So getting the results of all this fantastic scientific analysis out into the hearts and minds of the consuming public really is a challenge. So that's why I'm glad to be here today, so I can regurgitate some of this information to you, and you guys can all go back in your communities and do the same thing. Responsible goal setting is important because the biodiesel industry relies on public policy. It's important that those policies be responsible so that they promote sustainable growth in the industry but not overreach. We've seen that be the Achilles heel of a lot of other renewable fuels is over-promising or being too enthusiastic and not being able to fulfill those commitments. And again, all of this kind of builds into the successful public policy. We have to have good sound science to support good policy. There is no free market for petroleum. There is no free market for liquid fuels. So we as a society have to decide which fuels we want to use. And so we need good science to make good decisions on what's going to be in our fuel mix. Now like I said, all these are reasons that biodiesel is sustainable. There's lots of good stuff to talk about every one of these. I'm going to try and drill down just on the environmental benefits. That's what I spend the most time on and effort defending biodiesel's reputation on the environmental benefits. And drilling into environmental benefits, again, another bullet point of just here are some of the major environmental benefits of biodiesel. Cleaner tailpipe emissions. Biodiesel reduces carbon monoxide, reduces particulate matter, reduces ozone and smog formation, reduces polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are impactful to human health. Biodiesel itself is non-toxic and biodegradable. And if I'm critical of my own slides, I would say that this is probably not very important. Our society has demonstrated they're very comfortable using toxic fuels in their motor vehicles. But it can't hurt that biodiesel is non-toxic and biodegradable. The production of biodiesel actually reduces wastewater and hazardous waste relative to petroleum diesel. DOE did life cycle analysis on the water impacts, and they quantified that biodiesel's reduction of wastewater is on the order of 79% and approximately 96% compared to petroleum diesel. But the environmental benefits that I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is the superior energy efficiency, the life cycle carbon reduction, and our impacts on food security. And I want to welcome questions on all of these, especially the food security part, because I think that's the one that is probably the most complicated and maybe raises the most concerns or questions, particularly when you're hearing things about ethanol or biofuels in general and the food versus fuel soundbite, which has really been a challenge for us to address because our scientific explanation of how we impact the food industry is complicated. For one, because we use a very diverse set of feedstocks, whether they're first use vegetable oils or used vegetable oils or animal fats. They're all part of the food supply in one part or another. They all play a different role in the food supply. So just reminding you again that liquid fuel is necessary. And biodiesel happens to be the most efficient diesel fuel substitute that there is that we can produce. The renewable energy ratio for biodiesel is 5.5 to 1. So for every unit of energy we put into producing biodiesel, we're getting 5.5 units of usable energy out. So this includes all of the natural gas or electricity generated from coal, perhaps, that's used to operate an oilseed crush facility or a biodiesel conversion plant. It includes all the diesel fuel or gasoline that's used in tractors to grow and harvest a crop, and trucks to transport crops to production facilities. If you add up all that energy put into that production process, you get 5.5 times more energy in a gallon of biodiesel in your tank. And we're able to leverage our fossil energy sources to get this additional energy because we're capturing energy from the sun. Biodiesel stores solar energy in a liquid form. And one of the great things about this number is it's always improving. This number, in 1998, this number was 3.2 to 1. And it's continued to improve because farming's getting more efficient, production is getting more efficient. And so we can continue to improve our number. In fact, as we use more sources of renewable energy to produce biodiesel, we can move that number to infinity because we're ultimately gathering energy from the sun, which is exactly what we have to do as a society in order to be sustainable. And in contrast to that, the fuel we're displacing, petroleum, is always getting worse. I don't even know what the current number is. The last number I saw was probably 10 or 15 years old, and their number is about 0.8 to 1. So for every unit of energy that resides in crude oil underground, by the time you bring it to the surface, extract it, and refine it, turn it into usable fuel, you've already lost 20% of that energy. So, and that's only getting worse because all of the light sweet crudes that we used to have are now extinct. We've burned them. We've pumped that carbon into our atmosphere. So the remaining fossil fuels are only going to be harder to get to and more carbon intensive. We're going to lose more energy before we even get them into our fuel tanks. And when we think about how do we make society in general sustainable, the key really is sustainable energy. We need energy for a lot of the things we do. Our ability to harness energy, in some sense, is what civilized the human race. And all of the prosperity and advances that we have experienced as a result of mostly fossil fuels, mostly learning how to harness fossil fuels, it's not only made us rich and mobile, being able to transport people and goods from place to place, but it's also spilled over and given us the opportunity to develop higher education and information technology and healthcare and equal rights and civil rights. So all of these things are a result of our prosperity that comes from energy. So we're learning that we need to give up fossil fuels, that eventually they're going to run out on us anyway, but in the meantime, the economic damage and the climate change damage is probably going to be intolerable. So we need alternative sources of energy in order to maintain our standard of living so that we can preserve those things about human society that's really made us great. And so we think about our choices for energy. Fundamentally, they're rather limited. We have fossil fuels, we have nuclear energy, we have geothermal energy, and solar energy. And I'll group all of the solar energies into solar. I'm including wave energy, wind energy, hydroelectric, and biomass. All of those ultimately get their energy from the sun. It's the sun that drives our weather and the hydrologic cycle. Among all of those, the only renewable solar energy that we can pick up and take with us is biomass. That biomass is the only solar energy that's in a physical package that we can take with us, and that's what we need for transportation and mobile uses. We need energy to bring with us. Storing solar energy really is the major obstacle for all of the renewable energies, is how do you store it and use it where and when you want it. And I'm really proud to work in the biodiesel sector because fats and oils are nature's favorite device for storing energy. Liquids are energy dense. They can fit in any shape fuel tank. We're all wearing evidence of that the animal kingdom has figured out that fats are the best way to store energy, to take it with you and rapidly transform it back into energy like you need it. And oilseed crops are the same way. Oilseed crops that are annual crops, that they rely on their seeds or their progeny to carry on the race because they die every winter. So they have to invest energy in their seeds. And oil is the way that those crops have invested energy to be re-released when those plants need it for growth. And so I have a lot of hope that here's a formula that we can continue to harvest energy that we need for all the things that society wants to use energy for, and we can tap into a natural cycle. The plants have already figured out how to store energy from the sun and do it in a way that recycles carbon, so that we can work within the equilibrium of carbon between the atmosphere and the earth without taking carbon from deep underneath the ground and pumping it into the atmosphere. And going back to the life cycle analysis for biodiesel, that energy ratio, that 5-to-1 energy ratio, corresponds with a greenhouse gas savings. If that 5-to-1 energy ratio corresponds to approximately an 80% reduction, because the only net emissions from biodiesel production are the emissions of the fossil fuel we use to produce biodiesel. When you burn biodiesel, you're essentially burning plant material, and that plant took its carbon out of the atmosphere. When plants die and decompose, most of their carbon goes back to the atmosphere. So there's a natural cycle going on there, and we can be part of that natural cycle and harvest energy as part of that. And true enough, when you do the full life cycle analysis for biodiesel and factor in all the different kinds of energy that are used and the conversion factors, the greenhouse gas reduction for biodiesel is approximately 85%. So that's how we can say we can displace petroleum and reduce greenhouse gases, because we are using recycled carbon. We're taking very little carbon out of the ground to make our fuel. Anybody want to ask me any questions? You guys are very good students. Yeah.
You just explained that we are reducing carbon emissions. Why isn't biodiesel getting any carbon credits?
Well, we are, and it depends on how the carbon credits are traded. And I'm just about to talk about the federal policy that's really responsible for the commercial biodiesel industry. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand, if the government requires us to use this biodiesel, then you don't really get credit for doing an extra thing. You don't get a credit for an extra carbon reduction in addition to what the government's already requiring you. But the Renewable Fuel Standard has included greenhouse gas reduction thresholds in it, so that any fuel that wants to participate in that standard has to demonstrate at least some level of carbon reduction. And the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is similar in that regard, is that California has a carbon cap and trade program, and then they have a separate low carbon fuel standard because it's actually harder to demonstrate carbon credits in transportation fuel, because transportation fuel is liquid and it's limited. So they have a separate program for that. So we qualify in that low carbon fuel standard, and you could probably get some credits in the cap and trade program, but they would not be as lucrative. So you make more money in the low carbon fuel standard. So in a sense that I suppose you could consider them parallel policies. And internationally, that may be different depending on country policies. So that's actually a good segue into the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard. That's the major public policy that's promoting biodiesel on a national scale. The last 2 years we produced 1 billion gallons of biodiesel, and we would not have been at that level had it not been for the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard. And what I wanted to cover about that standard is the sustainability safeguards that are actually built into that program. Ethanol is the biggest part of that program. Conventional biofuel, which includes ethanol, has to meet a 20% greenhouse gas threshold. Biomass-based diesel and advanced biofuel have to meet a 50% greenhouse gas threshold. So that's one hurdle for all biodiesel to participate in that program. We have to demonstrate we reduce greenhouse gases by at least 50%. There's another requirement in there that I always like to point out, and that's the definition of renewable biomass. Because there is the concern that, while we think domestically produced biodiesel is a great thing, that there are economic and global impacts from that. And there's concerns about particularly tropical deforestation. If as agriculture becomes more profitable, does it incentivize people to turn natural ecosystems or forests into cropland? And so there's a specific prohibition put in the Renewable Fuel Standard that says You cannot convert any land that's not already in agricultural production into agricultural land for the purpose of producing renewable fuel. It's strictly prohibited. And the US has gone through a process, and Canada's gone through a process to basically look at our land use in conjunction with USDA and say, it's not happening in the US, that the farmland in the US is not expanding into virgin territory. So we sort of have an aggregate approval or an aggregate exemption for that. But any feedstock or any biofuel coming in from other countries has to certify individually that that feedstock came from land that was already in agricultural production prior to 2007.
So is it they have to certify the feedstock or the biodiesel that was made from the feedstock?
Both.
Wow.
Yeah.
Your definition of advanced biofuel is based upon the metric of greenhouse gas emissions. Can you explain how you do this calculation against the baseline life cycle greenhouse gas emissions?
So the baseline that EPA uses, and they say that this is what Congress mandated them to use, is they use average 2005 petroleum. So that's a little bit biased right there because we know the current petroleum is more carbon intensive than 2005 petroleum. But that's the baseline they use. And then EPA's done life cycle analysis individually for the biofuels and the feedstocks, and they include indirect impacts for first use agricultural oils. So they're actually do a very comprehensive life cycle analysis on the feedstocks. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well.
Who certifies these imported feedstocks?
US EPA.
So you
yeah.
provide them with documentation and they'll certify it?
Yeah, and I actually don't have firsthand knowledge of how that process works. I have heard that there's some of that has been going on because they've been importing sugarcane-based ethanol from South America. So somebody has gone through that process. I'm not aware of any biodiesel or biodiesel feedstocks doing it. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I'm not aware of it. 5 minutes, all right. I like questions, though, I do. And given the choice, I'll spend more time on questions than slides. So I do want to cover a little bit of the indirect land use change because that's an important part of how they do that life cycle analysis. And it's been one of the things that I think shook some of the support for biodiesel and biofuels in general, at least going back to 2008 or 2009, when the theory was first sort of dropped on the public. And make no mistake about it, the theory of indirect land use change was invented by people who did not want biofuels to succeed. It was invented by people who wanted the status quo. And so their theory was that as we promote agricultural products in the U.S., even if we're not letting people bring in products from other countries for biofuel, as we promote agriculture in the U.S., we're going to make it more economically feasible for farmers all around the world to produce more food. And if they're producing more food on new farmland, there's a greenhouse gas emission if they converted land, particularly if there was some sort of forest conversion involved. So they want to saddle the biofuels industry with those greenhouse gas emissions. Now, since this theory first was unveiled in 2008, there's been a lot of work on behalf of US EPA, the California Air Resources Board, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, academic institutions like University of Idaho, Purdue University, trying to do a better job of quantifying it. And the only way you can quantify it is through predictive modeling. It's an indirect impact you can't measure. You can only model it through economic models. And the economic models have improved quite a bit. They still have a lot of improvements to make. And what we're seeing now in the models is that, yes, this is true, that biofuels are a good thing for agriculture. They're a good thing for food production around the world. And even if you want to be conservative, measure those greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, essentially make that new food production carbon neutral, put that greenhouse gas emissions on the back of the biodiesel industry, we can take it. Because we can do both of those things and we can still reduce greenhouse gases more than petroleum. And so I think this theory that was really invented to stall enthusiasm for biofuels, I think now it's our tool to improve the modeling and actually use it to quantify how biofuels can help put more food in the world marketplace. We've always said that we don't negatively impact food supplies because we're using co-products. Well, this gives us a way to quantify it and say, yes, we're putting this many more acres, we're producing this many more tons of protein or vegetable oil, and we still have good greenhouse gas profile. Yeah.
What if it's
going to the water and not the land. How do they treat that?
That is it. Well, so that makes me think of algae. EPA has said that algae is a qualifying feedstock for biomass-based diesel production. So algae does not have to go through indirect land use change modeling.
Can you get carbon tax credits for the algae production?
You can, if you can make biodiesel out of algae, it qualifies as an advanced biofuel. EPA has already given that the green light, and they've done so without seeing a life cycle analysis of algae. There was enough confidence and enthusiasm. They want to promote at least the innovation and research to go into that product that they said, bring it on. And again, a good segue into the diversity of feedstocks that the biodiesel industry uses, and I wanted to talk about where does the biodiesel industry go from here. Essentially, here's the feedstocks we used in 2012. 55% of soybean oil. When biodiesel first got off the ground, 80% was soybean oil. Those were the first plants that got built. And we've done exactly what we intended to do for the soybean industry, and that was use up their surplus oil and bring equilibrium back to the prices that people were paying for vegetable oil and protein meal. Because as long as there was a surplus of oil on the market, even the oil that was getting used, and about 85% of oil was getting used for things like the filling inside of Twinkies and salad dressing and Hellmann's mayonnaise, they weren't paying their fair share because demand and supply were not balanced. So all the oil they were buying was a super bargain. They were not paying for the cost of that production. The people that were paying for the cost of that production were the people that were using the protein meal, the livestock producers, because they wanted the meal and they had to pay for the cost of producing the whole crop because the consumers of the oil weren't paying their fair share. So the biodiesel industry has worked like a perfect safety valve. Soybeans are grown or all oilseeds are generally grown for their protein. So they're grown to match demand for livestock feed. And most of the oil is used for lots of uses, and we can make sure that we use however much oil is produced, matching supply and demand. So everybody's sort of paying their fair share. But now that we've done that, if we want to grow, we have to use other feedstocks. And the graph is showing that we're continuing to grow through diversity, using more animal fats, more used cooking oil, more waste oils. And inedible corn oil is an excellent example. Inedible corn oil comes out of the back end of an ethanol plant. It's a product that did not exist 5 years ago. It's a product that was brought on through innovation. As the biodiesel industry signaled to the world that we want to grow, we need more feedstocks, somebody found oil that wasn't being used. After you take corn and make ethanol, the distiller's grains are fed to livestock. And there's still a little bit of oil in those distiller's grains. In fact, there's more oil that's really palatable to the cattle. So if we take out even half of that oil, some of that still goes to livestock feed, but then there's a new source of oil that we can use for biodiesel. So, and that's why we want to incentivize continued responsible growth of the industry, because that's how we're going to continue to provide incentives to collect all that used cooking oil that's out there, to incentivize people to develop cheaper ways to process trap grease and other low-cost but difficult-to-treat feedstocks. So our growth is from continued diversity. And with that, I think I'd love to take as many questions as we have time for, but they're signaling that we're out of time. It was definitely an honor to talk to you guys, and I'll be around to continue to answer questions.
So on one of your slides, it says, we can meet our goals for domestic biodiesel production and still not have an issue with land use. What are the projections? Like, I know that every year we're trying to produce more and more biodiesel, but we've only got a certain amount of land. So without going and cutting down more forests or using other land that's not currently being used, how do you expect to grow?
So there is an economic impact. There is land use change. And even if you quantify the greenhouse gas emissions with that, we're still better than petroleum. We're not going to grow biodiesel by growing more acres of soybeans. That just doesn't work economically unless there's demand for the protein. If there's demand for protein and that drives the increased soy acres, then we can be there to suck up the extra oil. And farmers are increasing their yield, so we do think there's going to be more oil that can come to biodiesel because farmers are increasing yield on existing acres. We are working on niche feedstocks that could be grown perhaps as winter cover crops or on land that's currently not economically productive for other reasons. Now that we've developed a market for oil, perhaps crops like pennycress or camelina that can grow in these areas and produce an oil crop, they might be commercial. They're probably going to be small scale or local, and that's another reason why they're perfectly suited for biodiesel, because biodiesel is really scalable. You can afford to build a small biodiesel plant to size based on the feedstock that's available.
On that feedstock chart that you had up, is that based on where does that come
I
from?
think this new data is coming from EPA, and you know the let's see, when you report a RIN, you have to report the feedstock you use to EPA, and EPA has approved specific feedstocks to meet the 50% greenhouse gas threshold. We used to get our data from the census, U.S. Census, and so the categories were broken up a little bit different, but I think this new data is coming from EPA.
So EPA RIN data or EPA in
It's
general?
tied to RIN
Okay.
data. Yeah.
Is that you, Don?
No, it's not. And I'm not even sure what decade that photograph came from. I mean, it might be pre-biodiesel, but I felt confident in being able to Photoshop that. Thank you guys for the questions, and I'll yield the floor, but I'd love to keep talking to you guys as much as I could.